At first, the colour seems impossible. A hand brushes away the last skin of compacted silt, and beneath it appears a band of blue that has not seen the Egyptian sun for roughly 3,500 years. Beside it, a red line sharpens into the edge of a human figure. Yellow still clings to carved stone. Black outlines remain where sand, flood deposits, demolition, and time should have erased them. On January 8, 2025, cameras gather at the western edge of Luxor as archaeologists lift decorated stone near the ancient processional road of Hatshepsut. Headlines speak of a lost temple returning from the sand, but the reality is stranger and more precise. No complete building has risen intact. What emerges is the surviving threshold of a vanished ceremonial world foundation walls, ritual deposits, royal names, and more than 1,000 decorated blocks from the Lower Valley temple of one of Egypt's most remarkable rulers. The excavation does not resemble Hatshepsut's polished geometry. Her famous terraced monument, Djeser-Djeseru, stands farther west beneath the cliffs of Deir el-Bahari, its colonnades ordered against pale limestone. Here, toward the ancient river plain, the ground is flatter, dustier, and more deceptive. Modern cultivation lies close by. Burial shafts, mud brick, broken limestone, gravel, and flood deposits overlap in layers accumulated by different centuries. The Lost Valley Temple once occupied this eastern end of Hatshepsut's sacred axis. It was not the same structure as the terraced mortuary temple visible beneath the cliffs. It was the ceremonial gateway to that higher sanctuary, joined to it by a raised causeway stretching approximately 1 kilometre. Anyone approaching from the Nile side would have entered here before moving westward toward the mountain. That distinction matters. The excavators are not merely uncovering loose decoration that fell from a famous temple. They are recovering evidence from a building whose place in the complex was fundamental, but whose physical form had almost disappeared. The Valley Temple stood between worlds. To the east lay the river, fields, settlements, boats, and live-in Thebes. To the west rose the desert necropolis, the royal cult, and cliffs associated with death, rebirth, and divine presence. Sacred processions passed through this zone. Priests, officials, offerings, statues, and divine barques moved along a route that transformed geography into ritual. The surviving stones belong to an entrance, but not an ordinary one. They marked the point where movement became ceremony and where Hatshepsut's authority was built into the road itself. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the mystery begins not with a secret chamber or golden object, but with the survival of surfaces. Stone can endure, yet painted stone is vulnerable. Pigment flakes away. Moisture moves salts through pores. Heat and cold stress exposed faces. Human hands recut and reuse. Buildings are quarried for later construction. Even when a wall collapses, its decorated side can shatter into fragments too small to identify. Against those odds, some newly revealed blocks still carry colour with startling clarity. Their survival is partly the result of burial. Covered in relatively dry conditions and shielded from sunlight, the painted surfaces entered an accidental darkness that preserved what open air would have weakened. Yet burial is not safety. The moment a block is uncovered, its environment changes. Air reaches it, temperature and humidity fluctuate. Powdery pigment stable underground may loosen. Conservators must document the condition, clean cautiously, strengthen fragile areas, and let the object adjust gradually. The instant when sand falls away begins a slower struggle. Every coloured line becomes both image and evidence. Its position must be recorded. Its breaks may match another fragment found meters away or during an earlier season. Soil adhering to it may reveal how it was buried. The excavation is not a treasure hunt in which the finest pieces are simply removed and displayed. It is an attempt to recover relationships from a field of destruction. Reports describe more than 1,000 decorated blocks and fragments, while excavation director Zahi Hawass gave the approximate figure of 1,500. The assemblage is still being processed. Counts change as fragments are registered, joined, separated, or reclassified. More than 100 limestone and quartzite tablets bearing Hatshepsut's royal names were also reported, along with foundation deposits containing ritual objects and model tools. Sections of the valley temple's foundation walls remained in unexpectedly good condition. Some decorated stones show Hatshepsut and Thutmose III in ritual contexts, preserving a political partnership that later history made harder to read. Other pieces carry traces whose complete scenes have not yet been reconstructed publicly. The evidence remains incomplete, and no comprehensive scholarly publication has yet presented the full catalogue, joining plan, and pigment analysis for all the newly found material. That uncertainty matters because spectacular discoveries invite instant completion. A face appears, and viewers imagine the whole wall. A royal name emerges, and the building seems fully identified. A line of blue survives, and the original temple rises in the mind with every surface restored. Archaeology rarely grants such clean returns. What has come back is not the Valley Temple as Hatshepsut knew it, but an archive of broken parts. Some fragments may fit together, others may remain isolated, beautiful and mute. The foundations can define parts of the plan, but not every room, doorway, or ritual station. Later burials crossed the site. Stone was removed in antiquity. Different periods left damage difficult to separate. Scholars still debate how particular episodes of alteration and reuse unfolded. Even so, the first impression remains powerful. Beneath the sand, the colours did not wait untouched by history. They survived because history covered them, broke them, buried them, and forgot exactly where they lay. The blue band, red contour, yellow surface, and black line are not merely decorations rescued from darkness. They are fragments of a controlled visual language created to make kingship permanent. Hatshepsut's names were placed beneath walls and within the monument's fabric. Her image appeared in ritual beside gods, and beside the younger king with whom she shared rule. The lower gateway prepared visitors for a journey toward the cliffs, but its decoration also proclaimed that the ruler who built this road belonged within the divine order. On that January morning, the buried gateway did not return as a complete temple. It returned as evidence enough stone to challenge old assumptions, enough colour to make the ancient complex feel newly present, and enough absence to keep its deepest questions open. Somewhere beneath later graves, mud brick, flood sediment, and desert debris, more of the structure may remain. Somewhere among the recorded blocks, two broken edges may still be waiting to meet. The lost temple is not standing again. It is beginning, fragment by fragment, to become readable. To understand what the excavators have brought back into view, the eye must travel westward across a landscape that no longer looks as it did in Hatshepsut's lifetime. Today, visitors approaching Deir el-Bahari see desert roads, cultivated fields, modern settlements, and the pale terraces of Djeser-Djeseru pressed against the cliffs. In the 15th century BCE, the Nile flowed along a different course. its floodplain spreading closer to the ceremonial zone. The lower temple stood near the edge of that river world, where boats, priests, officials, offerings, and royal processions could leave the water and enter a carefully ordered route. From there, a long causeway climbed west across the plain toward the terraced mortuary temple beneath the mountain. The two buildings belonged to one ritual complex, but they were not the same building, and confusing them erases the meaning of the journey between them. The famous structure seen in almost every image of Hatshepsut is Djeser-Djeseru, the Holy of Holies, arranged in rising terraces, colonnades, courts, chapels, and sanctuaries at Deir el-Bahari. Its horizontal lines appear to grow from the cliffs behind it, and its central axis directs movement toward the sacred interior of the mountain. The newly announced discoveries, however, come from the valley temple at the lower, eastern end of the processional route. That lost gateway was closer to the ancient floodplain and formed the first monumental stage of approach. It was where the complex met the river landscape, not where the terraces met the cliffs. Calling the newly uncovered remains simply Hatshepsut's temple is understandable shorthand, but it can make a lower ceremonial entrance sound like a rediscovered portion of the upper monument. Egyptian royal mortuary complexes were often designed as sequences rather than isolated buildings. Their meaning unfolded through movement. A visitor did not merely arrive at a sacred destination, the route itself transformed the experience. At the lower end, the valley temple received what came from the Nile. Beyond it, the causeway created a controlled passage through open ground. At the western end, the terraced temple gathered the traveller into courtyards and colonnades before drawing attention inward toward chapels and divine sanctuaries. The architecture made distance meaningful. It led from fertility toward desert, from the world of daily life toward the necropolis, and from the floodplain toward the western cliffs. The causeway linking the two ends extended for roughly 1 kilometre, although reconstructed alignments are not always expressed identically in modern accounts. It was more than a practical road, raised above parts of the surrounding terrain. It created a ceremonial spine through the landscape. Its surfaces and flanking elements may have helped frame processions, while the monuments at either end gave those movements a beginning and a destination. The recent excavations began in this broader processional zone, where surviving foundations and decorated blocks could still reveal how the lower temple belonged to the whole. The geography also carried a deeper religious logic. The east was associated with sunrise, renewal, and the inhabited world along the river. The west, where the sun descended, became the great landscape of tombs and cults for the dead. These associations were never simple opposites, because Egyptian religion repeatedly turned death toward rebirth. A procession crossing from the river toward the western cliffs did not move only into darkness. It entered a landscape where the deceased king could be renewed, where gods visited sanctuaries, and where ritual repeated the restoration of cosmic order. Hatshepsut's complex used this geography with extraordinary precision. The lower gateway did not merely provide access. It announced that the passage from river to mountain had been claimed, organized, and sanctified under her kingship. The cliffs of Deir el-Bahari made that claim especially powerful. Their vast limestone face forms a natural amphitheatre, and the mountain peak above was linked in Egyptian imagination with the protective goddess of the Theban necropolis. Nearby stood the older mortuary complex of Mentuhotep II, whose reign had become a model of restored political order. Hatshepsut's monument entered a landscape already dense with royal memory. Yet the valley temple placed the first statement of her presence far from the upper terraces. Before a participant saw the full drama of Djeser-Djeseru, the lower building prepared the encounter. Royal names, ritual imagery, controlled entrances, and foundation deposits turned the threshold itself into a statement of legitimacy. This is why the surviving fragments cannot be understood only as attractive pieces of painted relief. Their original position mattered. A figure carved near an entrance communicated differently from one placed in a sanctuary. A royal name buried in a foundation served another purpose from a name displayed at eye level. Blocks recovered without secure architectural context can still preserve style, titles, and ritual scenes, but their complete meaning depends on where they once stood. Excavators therefore map walls, deposits, cuts, and later intrusions with the same care given to decorated surfaces. The task is not simply to identify Hatshepsut's image. It is to determine how the lower temple organized approach, what spaces it contained, and how its decoration prepared movement toward the west. Modern photography creates another source of confusion. Reports about the Valley Temple are often illustrated with sweeping views of the terraced monument because that building is visually complete, recognizable, and closely associated with Hatshepsut. The buried lower site offers foundations, trenches, fragment tables, and broken stone rather than a standing facade. The upper temple supplies the image audiences expect. The lower temple supplies the new evidence. Viewers may therefore believe that colourful blocks have been lifted from beneath the famous terraces, or that a second complete temple has appeared beside them. Neither impression is accurate. What survives instead is the beginning of an architectural sentence whose ending still stands against the cliffs. The Valley Temple was the eastern gateway. The causeway was the long connective line. Djeser-Djeseru was the monumental western culmination. Together they formed a designed progression across the sacred landscape, from the ancient river margin to the mountain. Remove the lower temple from that sequence, and Hatshepsut's monument seems to begin abruptly in the desert. Restore it, even only through foundations and fragments, and the complex regains its first threshold, its connection to movement, and its relationship with the Nile. The famous terraces are not a solitary masterpiece placed beneath a cliff. They are one end of a ceremonial system extending across the plain. The newly exposed stones belong to the point where that system first engaged the living city. Their colours once met people arriving from the east, long before the colonnades above came into view. The gateway remains broken, but its return forces the ancient route to be imagined whole again, water behind, mountain ahead, and between them a road built to carry a ruler, a god, and an empire's vision of eternity. The work that produced the January 2025 announcement had already been underway for more than 2 years. In September 2022, a team connected with the Zahi Hawass Foundation and working in coordination with Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities began excavating along the processional zone associated with Hatshepsut's complex. That chronology matters because archaeology rarely unfolds in a single dramatic instant. The public sees a press conference, a row of newly cleaned blocks, and a date attached to the discovery. Beneath that moment lie seasons of survey, trenching, documentation, conservation, and argument. The Valley Temple was not simply found in 2025. It was gradually recovered through work that began in 2022, and only later reached the point where its significance could be presented to the world. The site demanded patience because nearly every layer belonged to a different historical moment. Excavators were not cutting into an untouched 18th dynasty surface. They were entering ground repeatedly used, altered, buried, and reopened across centuries. Mud brick structures from later periods sat above or beside older remains. Burial shafts interrupted earlier architectural lines. Flood sediments obscured wall edges. Broken limestone had moved from its original position, sometimes during ancient demolition, sometimes through later reuse, sometimes through erosion and collapse. A fragment carrying a royal cartouche might lie near material many centuries younger. The task was therefore not merely to uncover objects, but to disentangle sequences. The process began with the landscape itself. Archaeologists traced alignments that might belong to the ancient causeway and lower temple, comparing visible remains with earlier maps, excavation records, and the position of the upper complex. Trenches opened in areas where buried architecture was most likely to survive. Soil changed colour and density. Compacted surfaces appeared. Foundation lines emerged slowly, sometimes as little more than a difference in stone packing. Every shift had to be measured before more earth was removed. A wall exposed too quickly can lose the very evidence that explains when it was built, repaired, cut through, or abandoned. Work also moved according to the practical rhythm of the desert. Light changes the visibility of shallow carving. Wind fills cleared edges with dust, and fragile painted surfaces cannot be left exposed without protection. Progress measured in centimeters may preserve information that a faster excavation would destroy. In this setting, restraint is not delay, it is method. As the excavation advanced, the scale of the decorated material became clear. Blocks and fragments appeared not as a single collapsed wall waiting to be lifted, but as a vast disturbed assemblage. Some retained painted relief, others preserved inscriptions, borders, portions of clothing, limbs, ritual objects, or divine emblems. Many were incomplete enough to resist immediate identification. A curve might belong to a crown, a vessel, or the edge of a cartouche. A painted hand might eventually join a figure found elsewhere. The lesser-known reality of such work is that discovery often continues long after excavation. Inside registration rooms where photographs, dimensions, stone types, carving techniques, and break patterns are compared repeatedly. Nearly 3 years separated the beginning of fieldwork from the announcement on January 8, 2025. During that interval, the team built an argument from accumulation. Intact sections of foundation wall helped establish that the lower temple survived more substantially than expected. Foundation deposits linked the architecture to royal construction ritual. More than 100 stone name tablets carrying Hatshepsut's throne name and birth name strengthened the attribution. Decorated blocks showed scenes connected with royal cult and ceremonial action. A tablet bearing the name and titles of Sen-and-Mut introduced one of the most influential officials of the reign into the material record of the project. None of these elements alone restored the lost building, but together they formed a coherent archaeological case. The public announcement gathered several discoveries from the wider area, not only the valley temple material, rock-cut tombs, burial shafts, later cemeteries, inscribed objects, and remains from different periods were presented as part of a broader Luxor excavation story. This helped generate headlines, but it also encouraged details to blur together. Finds from adjacent contexts were sometimes described as if they belonged directly to Hatshepsut's temple. One nearby tomb was inaccurately promoted in some reports as the tomb of Queen Djeser-Djeseru. The better supported identification is the tomb of Djehuti-Mez, an official associated with the administration of Djeser-Djeseru's palace. Such distinctions may appear small, yet they separate evidence from repetition. Field archaeology depends on these corrections. A press conference must compress years of work into a few memorable statements. Archaeological interpretation moves more slowly. Initial readings are tested against inscriptions, stratigraphy, pottery, architectural parallels, and the position of objects in the ground. Counts remain provisional while material is catalogued. The total number of decorated blocks was reported as more than 1,000, while Hawass used the approximate figure of 1,500. Those numbers should not be treated as contradictory. One reflects a cautious threshold, the other conveys the probable scale of the assemblage. Until a complete catalogue is published, exact totals may continue to shift. The absence of a full specialist publication also shapes what can responsibly be said. By August 2nd, 2026, publicly available information still came mainly from official announcements, press reports, interviews with team members, and preliminary descriptions. No dedicated, peer-reviewed study had yet presented every newly found block, every proposed join, the complete architectural reconstruction, and a comprehensive pigment analysis. This does not weaken the discovery, it defines its current stage. Archaeology often enters public awareness before the slow work of publication is finished, creating a period when the importance of a find is clear but many details remain unsettled. What survives in the record suggests that the team had uncovered a major new body of evidence for the Valley Temple, not merely a scatter of decorative debris. Yet the route from trench to interpretation remains long. Each block must be stabilized and recorded. Each inscription must be checked. Each wall line must be compared with the changing history of the site. Some fragments may belong to later repairs or reuse rather than the original phase. Others may have travelled from nearby structures. Scholars still debate how much of the lower complex can eventually be reconstructed from the surviving remains. The January announcement was therefore not the end of the excavation story, but the moment when private field knowledge became a public mystery. For years, the team had followed walls beneath disturbed soil and watched isolated colours gather into a royal programme. Then, on a winter day in Luxor, the trench became a stage. Cameras saw painted stone and ancient names. The deeper achievement was less visible, a sequence reconstructed from layers, a lost gateway relocated within its landscape, and nearly 3 years of work condensed into the instant when the world was told that Hatshepsut's eastern threshold had begun to return. By the time the excavation team presented its results, the question was no longer whether Hatshepsut's lower temple had left traces. The question was how many different kinds of evidence had survived together and what each kind could reveal. The most immediately impressive finds were the decorated blocks, but they were only one part of the discovery. Beneath and around the processional zone, excavators identified well-preserved sections of the Valley Temple's foundation walls, ritual deposits placed during construction, more than 100 inscribed stone tablets bearing Hatshepsut's names, and a large body of carved and painted fragments. The finds did not amount to a complete standing temple. They formed something more difficult and, in many ways, more valuable, a damaged architectural archive still tied to the place where the building once controlled entry into the royal complex. The surviving foundation walls provide the skeleton of that archive. Decoration can move when a structure collapses or is dismantled, but foundations often remain close to their original position. Their alignments can reveal the orientation of rooms, entrances, courts, and boundary walls even when the upper masonry has vanished. At the Valley Temple, preserved foundation sections confirmed that substantial portions of the lower structure still lay beneath later activity. They allowed archaeologists to distinguish actual architecture from loose stone and to begin defining how the gateway related to the causeway. Yet foundations speak in outlines. They cannot by themselves restore the height of walls, the form of roofs, or the precise sequence of decorated spaces. Every architectural reconstruction must therefore remain provisional. Around this framework lay more than 1,000 decorated blocks and fragments. Zahi Hawass described the assemblage as approximately 1,500 pieces, a figure best understood as an estimate rather than a fully published final count. Some blocks preserve raised or sunk relief. Some retain painted outlines and broad areas of colour. Others carry only partial signs, a hand holding an offering, the curve of a royal crown, the edge of a throne, a divine emblem, or a line of hieroglyphs disappearing into a broken surface. The fragments are often dramatic precisely because they are incomplete. They reveal enough to identify ceremony, rank, and style, but not always enough to reconstruct the original wall. Among the reported scenes are images of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III performing rituals. Their presence together is important. Hatshepsut did not rule in a political vacuum, and Thutmose III did not vanish from the official imagery of her reign. The two kings could appear within the same ceremonial order, each participating in acts that sustained divine favour and royal legitimacy. Later attempts to alter Hatshepsut's memory have often encouraged a simple story of rivalry from the beginning. The surviving reliefs instead preserve the more complicated reality of co-rule, hierarchy, and changing political representation. What survives in the new assemblage suggests that the Valley Temple displayed this shared royal world at the point where processions entered the complex. The excavators also reported more than 100 limestone and quartzite tablets inscribed with royal names. These so-called stone names carry Hatshepsut's cartouches, including her throne name and birth name. Their repetition is striking. A royal name in ancient Egypt was not merely an identifying label. It was part of the person's enduring existence, a protected form through which presence could be maintained. To place names within the fabric of a building was to bind the ruler to the structure physically and ritually. Even when upper walls were removed, the buried names could continue to assert who had founded the monument and under whose authority the sacred ground had been claimed. Foundation deposits deepen that connection. Egyptian builders frequently placed groups of ritual objects beneath corners, thresholds, walls, or other significant points before construction advanced. The deposits might include miniature tools, pottery, food remains, plaques, model bricks, or objects inscribed with the ruler's name. They were not builders' rubbish accidentally trapped beneath the masonry. They marked a formal act of dedication, giving the project a consecrated beginning. At Hatshepsut's Valley Temple, the reported deposits included model tools and other ceremonial items. These objects evoke the moment when the building existed only as foundations and intention, when the ground was ritually opened and the king's project was placed under divine protection. One newly found limestone tablet carried the name and titles of Senenmut, the powerful official closely associated with Hatshepsut's court and major building programs. The tablet provides a direct administrative connection between Senenmut and the project. It does not prove that he alone designed the entire complex, nor does it settle the division of responsibility among Hatshepsut, Senenmut, the high priest Hapu-Seneb, other supervisors, architects, scribes, and skilled work crews. Monumental construction in New Kingdom Egypt depended on institutions, supply systems, and many levels of authority. The surviving inscription places Senenmut inside that network, but the exact boundaries of his role remain debated. Beyond the temple itself, the excavation encountered evidence from multiple cemeteries and tombs belonging to different periods. Their presence explains part of the site's complexity. The lower ceremonial zone did not remain frozen after Hatshepsut's reign. Later communities entered the area, cut shafts, built mud brick structures, deposited burials, and reused available stone, material from the Middle Kingdom, the late 17th dynasty, the Ptolemaic period, and other phases accumulated within or near the older monument. These later layers are not simply obstacles. They reveal how sacred and funerary landscapes were repeatedly claimed, forgotten, and reinterpreted. At the same time, they make it harder to determine where every displaced block originally stood. The finds announced in 2025 therefore belong to several scales of evidence. Foundation walls preserve the building's footprint. Deposits preserve its ceremonial beginning. Name tablets preserve royal identity. Decorated blocks preserve fragments of its visual program. Later tombs preserve the long afterlife of the place. No single category can reconstruct the Valley Temple alone, and no complete publication has yet shown how all of them fit together. The evidence remains incomplete, but its strength lies in convergence. Architecture, ritual objects, inscriptions, and imagery all point toward the lost eastern gateway of Hatshepsut's complex. Its recovery also changes the scale of the question, from whether a lower temple existed to how extensively its surviving remains can be reunited. What returned from the sand was not one spectacular object capable of telling the whole story. It was an immense set of partial witnesses. A wall line records where people once moved. A model tool remembers the founding ceremony. A cartouche fixes the king's name beneath the structure. A painted fragment catches the moment of ritual without preserving its beginning or end. Together, these remains transform the site from an empty space on a plan into a monument that can be questioned again. The Valley Temple is still broken, but it is no longer silent. The royal names do more than identify the builder. Buried beneath walls and thresholds, they reveal how Hatshepsut's authority was made part of the temple before the first painted scene was ever seen. More than 100 limestone and quartzite tablets carrying her cartouches were reported from the excavation, an unusually concentrated reminder that Egyptian monuments were founded not only with stone, labour, and geometry, but with words treated as living components of kingship. Hatshepsut's throne name and birth name were set into the architecture as if the building itself needed to remember who had caused it to exist. Long after walls were dismantled and reliefs broken, those names remained below ground, still attached to the ritual beginning of the Lost Valley Temple. In ancient Egyptian thought, a name was not a casual label. It was one element of identity, capable of sustaining presence beyond death and vulnerable to deliberate attack if erased. Royal titulary carried additional force because it placed the ruler within a cosmic and political order. A king did not possess only one name, but a sequence of names and titles expressing relationships with gods, lands, and ideals of rule. Hatshepsut's throne name, Mat-Kare, linked her to Mat, the principle of truth, balance, justice, and proper order, while invoking the solar god Ra. Her birth name identified her more personally within the royal line. When those names appeared on plaques hidden beneath a monument, they did not perform for a passing audience. Their audience was the sacred ground, the gods, and eternity itself. This makes the stone tablets especially powerful evidence. Visible inscriptions can be recut, plastered over, or removed when a regime changes. A buried plaque is different. It was placed where ordinary visitors would never see it, often before the masonry rose above the ground. Its purpose was not decoration but consecration. The names established ownership and legitimacy at the deepest physical level of the project. They declared that this gateway, its causeway, and the ritual movement beginning here belonged to Hatshepsut's reign. Even if later hands altered her image above, the foundation retained a quieter statement that could survive precisely because it had been hidden. The tablets belong to a broader tradition of foundation deposits found beneath Egyptian temples, tombs, palaces, and other important structures. Before construction advanced, chosen objects were placed in pits at significant architectural points. These deposits might contain miniature tools, model bricks, small vessels, food offerings, beads, plaques, or inscribed objects. Their exact contents varied by period and building, but the act itself transformed construction into ritual. Digging a foundation was not merely engineering, it was an encounter with sacred space, requiring purification, naming, offering, and protection. The ruler symbolically participated in laying out the monument, stretching cords, cutting the first trench, shaping bricks, or presenting tools, even though the physical labor belonged to organized crews. At the Valley Temple, the reported foundation deposits included ritual tools and objects associated with the building's dedication. A miniature adze, hoe, chisel, or brick mold would not have been used to raise the walls. It represented the act of building in ideal form. The model condensed labor into symbol. By placing such objects under the structure, the builders created a permanent ritual memory of the temple's birth. The deposit marked a moment that could never be seen once construction was complete, yet it remained active beneath the finished monument. The building stood above its own hidden origin story. This hidden layer also helps explain why archaeology can sometimes recover intentions that architecture alone cannot show. A foundation wall reveals where masonry stood. A deposit can reveal which ruler claimed the project, what ritual accompanied its beginning, and which symbolic language framed the work. When tablets repeat Hatshepsut's names dozens of times, the repetition is not redundant, it reinforces royal presence across the site. Each plaque may have belonged to a particular corner, gateway, wall, or stage of construction. Without a complete published plan, it is not yet possible to assign every tablet confidently to its original architectural location, and scholars still debate how these groups were distributed. Yet their collective message is unmistakable. Hatshepsut's identity was embedded systematically rather than added as an afterthought. That point matters because her reign has so often been narrated through later attempts to remove her. Modern audiences meet Hatshepsut as the ruler whose images were damaged, whose names were cut away, and whose statues were broken or reused. The foundation tablets reverse that perspective. They return to the beginning, before prescription, before dismantling, before the complex became a field of fragments. Here, the king's names are multiplied, protected, and ritually secured. The monument is not yet a ruin. It is a promise of permanence. The use of quartzite alongside limestone may also have carried practical and symbolic weight. Quartzite was harder, denser, and more difficult to work than local limestone. Its reddish tones could evoke solar associations, while its durability made it suitable for objects intended to endure. Not every material choice can be explained with certainty, and the evidence remains incomplete. but Egyptian builders rarely treated stone as neutral. Different stones carried visual, regional, and religious meanings. A royal name carved into a durable plaque was not simply written, it was materialized in a substance chosen to outlast ordinary surfaces. The discovery of so many name tablets also raises questions that only full publication can answer. Were they concentrated in one deposit or distributed across several? Did different groups correspond to separate construction phases? Were some placed during repairs under Thutmose III? Do variations in spelling, title sequence, stone type, or carving technique reveal changes in the project's administration? Public reports establish their importance, but not yet their complete archaeological pattern. Until the excavation records, drawings, and catalogues are available in specialist form, any detailed reconstruction must remain cautious. Still, their survival gives the Lost Valley Temple something more intimate than scale. Great architecture often overwhelms through mass, but these small objects preserve the deliberate act of naming. Somewhere beneath the unfinished threshold, workers lowered a plaque into a prepared pit, a cartouche was checked, ritual tools were arranged, offerings were placed. Then the deposit disappeared under fill and stone, never intended to be reopened. The temple rose above it, processions crossed over it, later generations altered the building, and the lower complex eventually vanished beneath new layers of use. When archaeologists uncovered those tablets, they did not merely find labels confirming attribution. They reached the concealed moment when Hatshepsut's kingship was joined to the ground. The visible monument could be attacked, repaired, quarried, and forgotten. The names below remained, repeating the claim that the gateway had been founded under Matkare. They survived because no audience was meant to see them, and their return now gives the ruined temple a voice from beneath its own foundations. Color is the first thing that makes the newly uncovered blocks feel alive, but color is also the most fragile part of their survival. Stone can persist after roofs collapse and walls are dismantled. Pigment is less forgiving. It flakes, powders, fades under sunlight, migrates with salts, and detaches when moisture moves through porous surfaces. The reds, blues, yellows, greens, blacks, and whites preserved on fragments from Hatshepsut's Valley Temple therefore represent more than decoration. They are evidence of an accidental environmental balance maintained underground for centuries, followed by a dangerous transition the moment excavation exposes them to air. The simplest explanation is burial in relatively dry conditions. Sand and compacted sediment shielded painted faces from direct sunlight, wind abrasion, and repeated human contact. In some areas, the blocks also avoided the prolonged moisture that can dissolve salts and carry them toward a surface where crystallization breaks paint from stone. Burial did not preserve every fragment equally. Some pieces lost almost all visible pigment, others retained only faint stains. A smaller number emerged with color strong enough to suggest how intensely painted the original temple once appeared. The contrast between them is important, because there was no single preservation environment across the entire site. Soil depth, orientation, drainage, stone type, surface preparation, and later disturbance all affected what endured. Ancient Egyptian relief was rarely intended to remain the pale limestone seen in many museums and ruins today. Sculptors carved figures and inscriptions, but painters completed the visual program. The stone surface could be smoothed and covered with a preparatory layer before mineral pigments were applied, sometimes with binding materials that helped them adhere. Black outlines defined forms, red, yellow, blue, green and white distinguish skin, clothing, crowns, plants, ritual equipment, hieroglyphic signs, and divine attributes. Color followed conventions, yet it was not mechanical. Variations in shade, layering, and finish created depth and emphasis. The temple did not merely display images, it surrounded movement with an ordered field of luminous signs. Blue is especially striking because ancient Egyptian blue was among the earliest synthetic pigments produced on a substantial scale. It was manufactured by heating a mixture that generally included silica, copper compounds, calcium, and an alkali source. The resulting material could be ground and applied in different particle sizes, producing shades from pale blue to deeper tones. Green might come from minerals such as malachite or from manufactured compounds related to Egyptian blue, while red and yellow often derived from iron-rich earth pigments. Black commonly came from carbon-based materials, and white from calcium compounds or other pale minerals. These broad identifications are well established for Egyptian polychromy, but they should not be mistaken for a complete laboratory analysis of every newly discovered Valley Temple block. That distinction is essential. Scientific work on painted decoration at the upper mortuary temple has examined pigments, varnishes, surface layers, and even cases where more than one painted phase may survive. Such research helps scholars understand the technological traditions available during Hatshepsut's reign and the later history of the complex. It does not automatically establish the exact composition of all colors recovered from the lower temple. By August 2026, no comprehensive specialist publication had presented a full pigment study of the entire new assemblage. The colors can be described as exceptionally preserved, but claims that every pigment has already been chemically identified would go beyond the published evidence. The greater danger begins after discovery. Underground, a block may remain stable within a narrow range of temperature and humidity. Once lifted, it enters a fluctuating environment. Water within the stone begins to redistribute. Salts may crystallize. Weak paint layers can curl or detach. Fine particles disappear with a careless touch. Conservators therefore do not simply wash the surface until the image looks brighter. They examine it under controlled light, photograph it, map losses and cracks, and test the response of pigment before cleaning. Loose areas may require consolidation with carefully selected materials. Soil can be removed gradually with soft tools, and blocks may need sheltered storage while they acclimatize. This process can appear frustratingly slow beside the drama of excavation, yet conservation is part of interpretation. Dust may conceal color, but it may also protect a fragile layer. A dark patch might be pigment, ancient varnish, soot, staining, or later contamination. Removing it without analysis can erase evidence. Consolidating too heavily can darken a surface or make future treatment difficult. Every intervention changes the object, so the aim is not to make a fragment look new. It is to stabilize what survives while preserving the possibility of later study. The blocks also preserve clues in the sequence of their painted surfaces. A color layer may lie over an earlier outline. A figure may have been adjusted during carving or repainting. Varnish can indicate a desired sheen or a later treatment. Damage patterns may reveal whether a face was deliberately attacked, weathered in place, or broken after the wall was dismantled. When fragments are joined, interrupted color bands can confirm a physical match that shape alone leaves uncertain. A tiny continuation of blue across two broken edges may restore part of a crown, skyband, or divine emblem. In that sense, color becomes structural evidence. Scholars still debate how extensively the lower temple's decorative program can be reconstructed. Public photographs show individual pieces, but the full arrangement of scenes has not yet been published. It remains uncertain which blocks came from entrances, courts, walls along the causeway, or later repairs. Some may have been moved from their original positions before final burial. The extraordinary preservation of selected surfaces should not create the impression that the whole monument can now be repainted in the mind with certainty. Even so, the surviving pigments change the emotional scale of the discovery. The ancient building was not the beige ruin imagined from weathered stone. It was vivid, controlled, and visually overwhelming. Royal bodies, divine skin, ceremonial objects, hieroglyphs, borders, and architectural details were differentiated by colour. Sunlight would have struck painted relief at the threshold where travellers left the river landscape and entered Hatshepsut's sacred axis. The lower temple announced kingship not only through mass and inscription, but through saturation. Now those colours survive in fragments under conservation lights, rather than beneath an open ceremonial roof. Their brilliance is incomplete and vulnerable. They endured because walls failed, blocks fell, and sediment sealed them away. Archaeology reverses that protection in order to recover knowledge, exposing the very surfaces burial preserved. Each fragment therefore carries a quiet paradox. To see the colour, it must be removed from the darkness that saved it. To keep it, conservators must create a new kind of shelter, one careful enough to hold 3,500 years of survival on a layer sometimes thinner than dust. The names beneath the foundations belong to a ruler whose path to kingship was anything but ordinary. Hatshepsut was born into the royal house as a daughter of Thutmose III, raised within a court where bloodline, ritual legitimacy, military power, and priestly authority were inseparable. She later became the principal wife of Thutmose III, her half-brother, and occupied the highest female position in the palace. When Thutmose II died, the heir was the young Thutmose III, a son born to a secondary wife. Hatshepsut assumed the role of regent, acting publicly on behalf of the child king. That arrangement was conventional enough. What followed was not. Within several years, Hatshepsut adopted the full titulary and visual language of an Egyptian king. She did not merely exercise influence behind the throne. She appeared in inscriptions with royal names, wore the crowns of kingship, performed rituals reserved for the sovereign, and presented herself as the earthly partner of the gods. Yet Thutmose III remained king as well. He was not formally removed, erased from contemporary rule, or replaced by another dynasty. Egypt now had two rulers occupying the same political and sacred system, though their rank and visibility were not equal. The arrangement is often called a co-regency, but even that term can make a carefully managed reality sound simpler than it was. Popular retellings sometimes describe Hatshepsut as a woman who seized power from a helpless stepson. That version has the advantage of drama and the weakness of assuming motives the evidence cannot prove. Egyptian kingship was not simply a chair that one person stole from another. It was a religious office sustained by temples, officials, estates, and royal kin. Hatshepsut's rise required more than personal ambition. It required enough cooperation for her names to be carved, her monuments financed, her rituals performed, and her image accepted in sacred spaces. Whatever private tensions existed, the system did not behave as though the throne had been captured overnight by force. Her legitimacy was built through overlapping claims, She was the daughter of Thutmose I. She was the widow and royal wife of Thutmose II. She had served as God's wife of Amun, an office of growing religious and economic significance. Most importantly, her monuments developed a theological account in which the god Amun chose and engendered her for kingship. At Djeser-Djeseru, scenes later known as the divine birth cycle showed Amun approaching her mother in the form of Thutmose I, followed by the conception, birth, and recognition of the future ruler. Such imagery did not function as biography in the modern sense. It placed Hatshepsut's accession inside divine intention. The tension in her representations reflects the difficulty of expressing a female individual through an office traditionally embodied as male. Early images could show Hatshepsut with feminine dress and bodily form, while still assigning her royal insignia and titles. Over time, many official representations adopted the conventional masculine body of a king: broad shoulders, short kilt, ceremonial beard, and male grammatical forms. This was not necessarily an attempt to disguise the fact that she was a woman. Inscriptions could preserve feminine references, and her identity was known to the court. The transformation suggests that kingship followed inherited conventions stronger than portraiture. To depict the sovereign was to depict an institution as much as a person. That change has encouraged the misleading idea that Hatshepsut pretended to be a man. She did not erase every sign of her sex, nor did Egyptian officials suddenly forget her history as queen and regent. She adopted the iconography required to perform kingship in temples, where the ruler appeared not as a private human being but as the ritual guarantor of order. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how contemporary audiences understood the balance between Hatshepsut's female identity and the masculine visual grammar of office. What survives suggests flexibility rather than concealment. Her throne name, Matkara, made the claim explicit. Mat was the balanced order the king was expected to maintain against chaos. By placing Mat within her royal name, Hatshepsut announced that her reign did not disrupt the cosmic system, it fulfilled it. Her inscriptions linked her rule to divine approval, ancestral succession, prosperous building, and restored sanctuaries. Monumental programs at Karnak and Deir el-Bahari turned those ideas into visible stone. Obelisks rose in the temple of Amun. Chapels, processional routes, statues, and reliefs multiplied her ritual presence. The Valley Temple at the eastern end of her mortuary complex belonged to this larger effort to make legitimacy tangible. Thutmose III's place within that order was equally important. He appears in monuments of the joint reign, participates in rituals, and continued to mature within royal institutions. Later, he would become one of Egypt's most successful military kings, leading campaigns and expanding imperial influence. During Hatshepsut's dominance, however, public emphasis often favoured her. This imbalance may have generated tensions, but direct evidence for a simple personal feud is lacking. Court politics rarely leave honest emotional records. No single explanation fully accounts for how decisions were negotiated between the two royal households and their supporters. The officials around Hatshepsut were essential to her rule. Senenmut, Hapuseneb, Djehusi, and others administered building projects, temple resources, royal estates, and ceremonial production. Their careers reveal a government capable of coordinating labour and wealth on a large scale. Senenmut's prominence has made him the subject of romantic speculation, especially because of his close service to Hatshepsut and his responsibility for Neferur. Yet no reliable evidence proves that he and Hatshepsut were lovers. Their association was politically significant and perhaps personally close, but turning it into a confirmed romance substitutes modern expectation for ancient documentation. Hatshepsut's reign also appears more stable than the language of usurpation implies. Trade expeditions, quarrying, temple restoration, and monumental construction required functioning administration. The famous expedition to Punt, represented at the upper mortuary temple, displayed access to incense, exotic materials, and distant networks. It projected abundance rather than crisis. Military activity continued under the joint reign, though later royal narratives magnified Thutmose III's achievements. Hatshepsut's image as a purely peaceful builder and his as a purely martial successor are useful contrasts, but they oversimplify two intertwined reigns. The lower temple emerged from this political world. Its foundations were laid when Hatshepsut needed not only to possess power, but to make that power appear timeless, divinely sanctioned, and architecturally inevitable. Her names beneath the walls, her images beside Thutmose III, and the ritual road leading toward the cliffs converted a contested human arrangement into sacred order. The woman who began as regent became king not through one declaration, but through a sustained transformation of title, image, ceremony, and landscape. The Valley Temple stood at the threshold of that transformation, welcoming every procession into a world where Matkare's kingship had already been written into the ground. Power became most convincing when it appeared to belong to the landscape itself. At Deir el-Bahari, Hatshepsut's architects did not place a temple before the cliffs as though the mountain were merely a backdrop. They arranged terraces, ramps, courts, and colonnades, so the monument seemed to extend the natural geometry of the bay. Horizontal lines answered the layered limestone. A central axis drew the eye westward and upward. The building did not overwhelm the cliff by height. It made the cliff complete its composition. Hatshepsut's kingship, already embedded beneath the Valley Temple in names and ritual deposits, now rose into architecture, suggesting that the ruler had been anticipated by the land itself. The upper monument, Djeser-Djeseru, occupied a place already charged with royal memory. Beside it stood the older mortuary complex of Mentuhotep II, the Middle Kingdom ruler associated with Egypt's reunification after political fragmentation. Hatshepsut's builders clearly worked within a landscape shaped by that predecessor. Both complexes used the western bay, axial approach, terraces, and the dramatic relationship between constructed form and mountain. Yet Djeser-Djeseru was not a simple copy. Its proportions, colonnaded fronts, sequence of courts, chapels, and sanctuaries created a distinct architectural language. It referred to an authoritative past while presenting Hatshepsut's reign as the next perfected expression of order. This balance between inheritance and innovation was politically useful. Egyptian kings rarely claimed legitimacy by rejecting everything before them. They restored, renewed, completed, and surpassed. By building near Mentuhotep II, Hatshepsut entered a tradition of rulers who had re-established stability. By reshaping that tradition, she made it serve the 18th dynasty and the cult of Amun. The architecture allowed the past to endorse the present without making the new ruler appear dependent upon it. Stone performed an argument inscriptions alone could not. Hatshepsut belonged here because her monument aligned dynasty, deity, and landscape into one controlled sequence. That sequence began far below the famous terraces. The Valley Temple was the eastern threshold where arrivals from the river entered the sacred system. From there, the causeway extended toward the cliffs, making approach gradual and deliberate. The distance allowed anticipation to build while the upper temple remained ahead, framed by the western mountain. Processional movement transformed open ground into ceremonial space. Every step narrowed the separation between the living city and royal cult, the floodplain and desert, ordinary travel and ritual participation. At Djeser-Djeseru, movement continued through ascending levels rather than ending at a single facade. Broad ramps carried participants from one terrace to another. Colonnades controlled light and shadow. Open courts admitted the sky, while chapels and sanctuaries concentrated attention into smaller spaces. The architecture created alternating rhythms of exposure and enclosure. A procession could be seen across a terrace, disappear beneath a colonnade, emerge into another court, and finally approach the sacred interior. The monument was not designed to be understood from one viewpoint. Its meaning unfolded through the body in motion. Different parts of the complex served different divine and royal relationships. Chapels honored Hathor and Anubis. Other spaces connected Hatshepsut with Thutmose II and with her own mortuary cult. The central axis led toward the sanctuary of Amun, cut into the rock behind the terraces. This placed the god's presence deep within the mountain while royal imagery guided the approach. The temple joined several cultic functions honoring the dead ruler, serving major deities, supporting festival processions, and maintaining offerings through an organized priesthood. The building's apparent harmony conceals the labor required to create it. Stone had to be quarried, transported, dressed, lifted, set, carved, plastered, and painted. Surveyors established alignments with cords, measuring rods, and accumulated geometric knowledge. Scribes recorded deliveries and labor. Officials coordinated food, tools, workshops, transport, and specialized crews. The final monument presented effortless order, but that effect depended upon disciplined administration and thousands of repeated decisions. Even the terraces required adaptation. The cliff was not a perfect architectural surface. Builders negotiated uneven bedrock, older structures, drainage, and geological weaknesses. Some spaces were cut into the mountain, others were constructed before it. Repairs and modifications occurred during the temple's ancient life, while modern restoration has shaped what visitors see today. Scholars still debate aspects of the original appearance, including the treatment of gardens, statues, ramps, and approach zones. No single reconstruction fully accounts for every surviving trace. Vegetation may have intensified the contrast between temple and desert. Tree pits and garden installations suggest planted areas once accompanied parts of the approach and terraces. Imported incense trees associated with punt were represented in reliefs, and living plants may have carried sensory and symbolic power within the complex. Maintaining greenery in this setting required continuous labor. Trees would have turned architecture into a controlled micro-landscape of stone, shade, fragrance, color, and ritual abundance. Statues multiplied Hatshepsut throughout the complex. Some showed her seated, kneeling with offerings, standing in royal form, or represented as Osiris against pillars. Repetition was not decorative excess. Each image established a particular ritual presence. The ruler could greet a god, receive life, offer vessels, guard an axis, or participate eternally in ceremonies performed by priests. Architecture organized these images so kingship appeared wherever movement demanded it. The human ruler might be absent or dead. The monument ensured that the ritual king remained active. This system explains why the Valley Temple mattered. It was the first architectural moment in which arrivals encountered Hatshepsut's sacred landscape. Before the causeway stretched west, before the terraces rose, and before the sanctuary entered the mountain, the lower gateway established the rules of approach. Its painted walls and royal names prepared visitors for the larger composition. The upper temple transformed cliffs into a stage for divine kingship. But the Valley Temple began that transformation where river traffic and human movement entered royal space. Seen as a whole, the complex converted political legitimacy into a physical journey. Hatshepsut's claim occupied the eastern threshold, extended along a kilometre of causeway, climbed through ordered terraces, and ended in the sacred depth of the western rock. Mentuhotep II's presence anchored the site in remembered restoration. Amun's sanctuary placed divine authority at its heart. The cliffs supplied permanence beyond masonry. What survives suggests that every element worked together to make Hatshepsut's rule appear less like an exception and more like the natural fulfillment of Egypt's sacred order. The recovered foundations at the lower end restore the opening movement of that argument. Without them, Djeser-Djeseru can seem like an isolated masterpiece admired from the desert floor. With them, it becomes the culmination of a route that began near the ancient Nile. The monument's power lay not only in what stood beneath the cliffs, but in how people were led toward it. Architecture did not merely represent Hatshepsut's authority. It trained the landscape, the procession, and the viewer to experience that authority as inevitable. The lower gateway was built not only for human arrival, but for the passage of a god. Hatshepsut's Valley Temple stood at the edge of a sacred world that began across the Nile at Karnak. There, within the great eastern bank sanctuary, the image of Amun rested in darkness, enclosed within a shrine. During the beautiful festival of the valley, that divine presence left its usual home, crossed the river, and entered the western landscape of temples and tombs. The journey turned water, road, architecture, music, incense, and controlled crowds into a single ceremonial act. At Hatshepsut's complex, the Valley Temple formed the first monumental threshold through which that act could pass. The divine image itself was not exposed like a statue carried openly through the streets. It was placed within a portable shrine mounted on a sacred barque, a ceremonial boat-shaped structure borne on poles by teams of priests. Larger vessels transported such shrines across the Nile, while processional barques allowed movement on land. A shrine, barque, fittings, cloth, and ritual equipment required trained bearers who moved in coordination, pausing at designated stations. Temples, landings, gateways, and resting places made divine travel possible. The journey's sacred meaning depended upon both movement and the carefully staged places where movement stopped. From Karnak, the procession moved toward the river amid an atmosphere unlike the quiet ruins seen today. Priests carried standards and ritual objects. Incense smoke marked the air. Musicians, officials, and temple personnel participated according to rank and access. Offerings accumulated around the event. The god's departure from the eastern bank transformed ordinary geography. Streets and quays became part of a sacred route, and the crossing toward the west joined Amun's living cult with places of royal and ancestral memory. The exact course of every festival procession changed over time, and scholars still debate details of particular routes during Hatshepsut's reign. The Nile Channel shifted across the floodplain, while quays and canals were rebuilt. Texts and reliefs preserve idealized ceremonies rather than complete logistical maps. Even so, The broad pattern is secure. The beautiful festival of the valley brought Amun from Karnak to western Thebes, where the god visited royal mortuary temples. Hatshepsut's complex occupied a privileged place within this ritual landscape. The valley temple was where river movement became terrestrial procession. Boats approached the western side through waterways closer to the ancient cultivation edge than the Nile lies today. Sacred cargo, priests, and attendants disembarked near the lower end of the complex. From there, the god could enter the gateway and proceed along the raised causeway toward Djeser-Djeseru. The river had carried Amun across the boundary between east and west. The causeway now directed the divine presence toward the mountain sanctuary. Every architectural element helped regulate that passage. Doorways narrowed movement, courts allowed pauses, offerings, or reordering of participants. Painted reliefs established the correct relationship between king and god. Royal images performed acts that the living ruler might not personally enact at every moment. In temple art, Hatshepsut could greet Amun, offer incense, present food, receive life, or accompany the divine barque eternally. The wall did not merely record a festival, it sustained the ritual pattern beyond any single performance. The newly reported fragments showing Hatshepsut and Thutmose III in ceremonial settings belong to this broader world. Although the complete reconstruction has not yet been published, it would be premature to assign every fragment to a specific festival episode. A hand holding a vessel might belong to many offering rituals. A barque element or divine standard requires context before it can be tied securely to the valley festival. What survives suggests a rich program of royal service to the gods, but the evidence remains incomplete. Entire processions cannot responsibly be rebuilt from isolated pieces. Still, the function of the lower temple gives these fragments a vivid setting. Imagine the eastern gateway before dismantling, its limestone surfaces covered in colour, its inscriptions naming Mortuary, its interiors opening toward the causeway. The approaching procession brought movement into imagery already filled with movement. Painted figures carried offerings while living attendants carried real ones. Carved incense burners released no smoke, but smoke drifted before them. Stone representations of the king accompanied a ceremony enacted by priests, officials, and bearers in the same space. Architecture and performance overlapped until the temple seemed to participate. The festival also connected the royal cult with households across Thebes. Families visited tombs, brought food and drink, and renewed bonds with their dead. The western necropolis was not a permanently sealed zone of silence. On festival days it became socially active, filled with movement between chapels, tombs, temples, and gathering places. The god's visit offered renewal not only to deceased kings, but to the wider community of ancestors. Amun crossed the river, and the boundary between living and dead became temporarily more permeable through ritual. This wider participation did not erase hierarchy. Access to inner spaces remained controlled. Elite officials approached places ordinary spectators could not enter. Priests handled sacred equipment under strict rules of purity. The divine image remained hidden inside its shrine, yet concealment increased rather than diminished its power. People encountered the god through movement, music, scent, the reactions of officials, and the visible barque that contained an invisible presence. The procession made absence palpable. A lesser-known aspect of Egyptian temple ritual is how much depended on repeated stops. Sacred barques were heavy, routes were long, and ceremonies required moments of rest and offering. Way stations and barque shrines allowed bearers to lower the divine burden while priests performed rites. Along major routes, These stations divided distance into sacred intervals. Whether every stopping point associated with Hatshepsut's lower complex can now be located remains uncertain, but the Valley Temple belonged to a system designed around arrival, pause, transition, and renewed movement. Once inside the western complex, Amun's barque advanced toward the upper terraces and the sanctuary cut into the cliffs. The journey compressed Egypt's sacred geography into a single axis. It began at Karnak, crossed the Nile, entered the western necropolis, passed Hatshepsut's lower gateway, climbed the causeway, and approached the mountain. Hatshepsut stood at every stage through name, image, architecture, and cult. Her legitimacy was renewed whenever the god travelled the route she had monumentalized. This is why the Valley Temple cannot be reduced to an entrance building. It mediated between water and land, city and necropolis, human traffic and divine procession. Its walls prepared the god's approach, its foundations secured the king's claim, and its position made it the hinge of the ceremonial landscape. The upper temple beneath the cliffs may have been the destination, but the lower gateway was the moment of transformation. Here, a boat journey became a sacred road, a hidden image entered Hatshepsut's domain, and the lost temple became the doorway through which Amun crossed into the west. The world represented on Hatshepsut's walls extended far beyond the processional road between the Nile and the cliffs. At the upper mortuary temple, one of the most famous relief cycles of the reign, records an expedition to Punt, a distant land associated with incense, exotic trees, valuable woods, animals, and maritime trade. These scenes do not come from the newly announced Valley Temple blocks, and no published reconstruction has yet shown that the lower temple contained the Punt narrative. That distinction must remain clear. Yet Punt belongs naturally to the larger story because it reveals the economic, religious, and imaginative world in which Hatshepsut's monuments were created. The painted fragments below were part of a kingdom that defined royal success through the ability to reach distant coasts and bring their abundance into the service of the gods. The expedition scenes at Djeser-Djeseru present a carefully ordered voyage. Egyptian ships move across the Red Sea, their hulls crowded with sailors, ropes, steering oars, cargo, and officials. The vessels arrive at a foreign shore where houses appear raised above the ground, reached by ladders and surrounded by unfamiliar vegetation. Local leaders greet the Egyptian party. Goods are exchanged, incense trees are prepared for transport, and the returning ships are loaded with products that made Punt desirable within Egyptian ritual and elite culture. The images are unusually detailed, but they are not neutral documentary photographs. They are royal art, designed to show that Hatshepsut has restored access to a sacred and wealthy land under divine command. Punt had been known to Egypt long before Hatshepsut. Earlier expeditions are attested in inscriptions and texts from the Old and Middle Kingdoms, although the surviving evidence is uneven. By the 18th dynasty, the region was associated especially with aromatics such as frankincense and myrrh, substances burned in temples and used in medicine, cosmetics, purification, and funerary practice. Incense transformed space through scent. Its smoke marked divine presence, cleansed ritual environments, and carried offerings upward. Securing incense was therefore not merely commercial success. The trade therefore joined practical supply to sacred obligation. The Punt reliefs emphasize living trees as well as harvested resin. Men carry young incense trees with their roots enclosed in baskets or soil, suggesting an attempt to transplant foreign plants into Egyptian sacred gardens. Whether all such trees survived after arrival is uncertain, but the act itself had strong meaning. Hatshepsut was not only importing luxury goods, she was bringing a fragment of a distant divine landscape into Egypt. At Deir el-Bahari, gardens and planted areas may have made that claim visible. The desert temple could become an environment of shade, fragrance, water, and exotic life, maintained through constant labor. Other products included ebony, ivory, animal skins, gold, and living animals. The reliefs depict baboons, creatures closely associated with the sun and with the god Thoth. Their presence records the movement of living creatures across long distances and the logistical systems required to keep them alive during transport. Maritime expeditions carried food, water, crews, interpreters, guards, traders, and officials, all dependent on knowledge of winds, coastal routes, anchorages, and seasonal conditions. Where Punt was located remains one of the enduring questions of Egyptian archaeology. Most specialists place it somewhere in the southern Red Sea region or the Horn of Africa, possibly involving parts of present-day Eritrea, eastern Sudan, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Somalia, or a wider network connecting several of these areas. The reliefs alone do not supply a modern border. Plants, animals, landscape details, and trade goods point broadly southward, but they cannot define a single capital or fixed territorial state. Punt may have been a region known through multiple coastal and inland communities, rather than one politically unified kingdom. Recent scientific work on ancient baboons has added a striking clue. Genetic and isotopic studies have compared ancient baboon remains with modern populations, attempting to identify the regions from which animals were obtained. Research linking some baboons to the area around Adulis in present-day Eritrea strengthens the connection between Egyptian trade and the southern Red Sea. Adulis became a major port in later antiquity, and the biological evidence suggests that this coast participated in long-distance animal exchange over extended periods, yet the results do not prove that Hatshepsut's Punt was identical with the later city of Adulis. They narrow possibilities and illuminate networks, but no single explanation fully accounts for every ancient reference. The expedition also required an overland stage. Egyptian ships destined for the Red Sea likely began with personnel and supplies, moving from the Nile Valley across the eastern desert to a coastal harbour. Ships could be assembled or repaired near the coast, sometimes from timbers transported in sections. Crews then sailed southward through waters that demanded careful timing and practical knowledge. The polished relief sequence compresses this complexity into an effortless royal achievement. It does not show every hardship, negotiation, delay, or failed calculation behind the voyage. Hatshepsut's inscriptions present the expedition as obedience to Amun. The god desires the products of Punt, and the king fulfills that desire. This framing turns foreign trade into ritual service. The wealth returns not merely to palace stores but to temple offerings and monumental display. Incense, trees, precious materials, and animals confirm that the ruler can open routes, command resources, and maintain cosmic order. The expedition becomes another argument for legitimate kingship, parallel to the causeway, sanctuary, and royal names beneath the valley temple. It is tempting to imagine that some newly recovered coloured blocks depict ships, foreign landscapes, or the people of Punt. Public reports, however, have not provided a complete scene-by-scene catalogue supporting that claim. The announced fragments include ritual imagery and royal figures, but until joins and architectural positions are published, assigning famous upper temple narratives to the lower assemblage would be speculation. It prevents one monument's known scenes from being projected onto another simply because both belong to Hatshepsut. The connection between them lies deeper. The Valley Temple received processions from the river, while the Punt narrative celebrated ships returning from a distant sea. Both transformed movement into royal meaning. One route carried Amun westward toward the cliffs, another brought incense, animals, and foreign materials northward into Egypt. At the center of both stood Hatshepsut, represented as the ruler capable of directing sacred traffic across landscapes. The colors surviving under the lower temple's sand therefore belong to an age of wide horizons. Their makers lived in a state whose official crossed deserts, sailed unfamiliar coasts, cultivated imported trees, and translated distant peoples into royal imagery. Punt remains geographically unresolved, and the new blocks do not solve that mystery. What they restore is the gateway to the same ceremonial world, a world in which blue paint, incense smoke, carved ships, living baboons, and a road toward the western mountain all express the reach of Matkari's rule. The name of Senenmut appears on one of the newly reported limestone tablets, and with it a familiar figure steps into the excavation. Few officials from ancient Egypt have attracted more speculation. He rose to extraordinary prominence under Hatshepsut, held many titles, supervised royal projects, and became closely associated with the education of the king's daughter Neferu. His monuments appear near Deir el-Bahari. His image was placed in unusual positions within sacred architecture, and his career seems to have depended directly on Hatshepsut's confidence. A tablet from the Valley Temple therefore offers a powerful connection between the lost gateway and the administrative world that built it. Yet it does not settle the question modern audiences most often ask: was Senenmut the single mind behind Hatshepsut's monumental vision? The surviving evidence does not support so simple an answer. Egyptian royal construction was rarely the product of one architect in the modern sense. A vast complex required quarry administrators, surveyors, stoneworkers, scribes, priests, transport officials, workshop supervisors, painters, sculptors, treasury staff, and men responsible for organizing labor. Senior officials could direct or oversee large parts of the work, but responsibility was distributed across institutions. Hatshepsut herself shaped the political and religious program. The priesthood of Amun influenced sacred requirements. Other officials, including Hapusneb and Jehuti, held roles connected with temples, finance, and construction. Senenmut was unquestionably important, but importance is not the same as sole authorship. His titles reveal the breadth of his position. He served as steward of Amun, oversaw royal estates, and held responsibilities linked to building and temple administration. Some inscriptions associate him with works at Karnak and with Hatshepsut's obelisks. He was also guardian or tutor to Neferu, appearing in block statues that enfold the princess within his cloak. These images place him physically close to the royal family, while presenting that closeness through official service. The accumulation of titles suggests a man trusted with resources, access, and coordination at the highest level. It also warns against reducing him to a romantic supporting character in Hatshepsut's biography. The newly found tablet matters because context gives titles weight. A name in a tomb can proclaim status after death. A name on an object connected with the Valley Temple may record participation in the project itself. Public accounts describe the tablet as bearing Senenmut's name and titles, linking him administratively to construction at the lower complex, until a complete publication presents its exact wording, find spot, and relationship to nearby deposits. The safest conclusion is that he had an official connection with the work. whether he supervised a particular phase, controlled supplies, represented the royal household, or exercised broader authority over the entire complex remains open. This uncertainty reveals how monuments were actually made. Modern culture prefers the idea of a single genius sketching a masterpiece into existence. Ancient Egyptian buildings emerged through a chain of command, inherited techniques, religious conventions, political decisions, and skilled repetition. Design could change during construction. Walls were adjusted to bedrock. Decorative programs were revised. Names and figures were recut when political circumstances shifted. The finished temple concealed this negotiation beneath an appearance of perfect order. Senenmut may have been one of the central organizers who made that order possible, but the monument was larger than any one official. His own monuments add to the mystery. Senenmut prepared more than one burial place, including the famous tomb known as TT 353, cut near Hatshepsut's temple. Its ceiling preserves an astronomical composition, one of the most discussed from ancient Egypt. Stars, deities, constellations, and celestial cycles cover a chamber hidden underground. The tomb's location beneath the approach to Djeser-Djeseru has often been interpreted as evidence of unusual privilege and deliberate closeness to Hatshepsut's monument. Yet scholars still debate how the tomb was intended to function, whether it was ever used for burial, and what its position meant politically or ritually. Small images of Senenmut also appear in concealed or subordinate areas of Hatshepsut's monuments. In some cases, his kneeling figure was carved behind doors or within niches where it could be hidden when a door stood open. Such placements were exceptional for a non-royal official. They suggest privileged access to sacred space and a desire to remain eternally associated with temple ritual. They do not, however, prove private intimacy. Egyptian officials often described service to the king in language of devotion, favour, and nearness. Royal patronage was the source of status, livelihood, and memory. The claim that Hatshepsut and Senenmut were lovers rests largely on inference, later imagination, and ambiguous evidence. A crude graffito from a quarry or worker's shelter has sometimes been interpreted as a sexual caricature of a female ruler and a male official, but the identities are uncertain. Even if it mocked Hatshepsut and Senenmut, satire would reveal rumour rather than confirm a relationship. Their political association was unusually close, and personal affection is possible. But no reliable text identifies them as romantic partners. Presenting the idea as fact turns silence into proof. Senenmut's disappearance from the surviving record has encouraged further drama. His career seems to end before Hatshepsut's death, and some of his monuments suffered damage. His names and images were attacked in places, though the timing and agents are difficult to establish. This has produced theories of disgrace, political fall, retirement, or death. None can be demonstrated fully. Damage may belong to more than one period, including later campaigns against Hatshepsut's memory. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation accounts for every altered inscription. The tablet from the Valley Temple returns attention to what can be established. Senenmut was not merely a figure hovering at the edge of Hatshepsut's reign. He was part of the machinery through which royal ambition became organized labor, carved stone, and sacred space. His name within the lower complex suggests that the gateway belonged to the network of projects he helped administer. It places him not in whispered romance but in the practical world of foundations, deliveries, craftsmen, and ritual planning. That world required collaboration. Hatshepsut defined the royal claim, Priests articulated divine relationships. Senior officials translated policy into schedules and resources. Surveyors fixed the axis. Quarrymen cut stone. Boat crews transported it. Sculptors and painters transformed walls into active ritual surfaces. Scribes counted rations and recorded work. The Valley Temple emerged from this collective system, even if certain names stood higher within it than others. Senenmut's tablet is therefore both revealing and restrained. It confirms presence without granting complete authorship. It brings one influential official into the excavation while leaving the larger design process unresolved. Like the painted blocks around it, the inscription offers a fragment of a wider arrangement. A name has stepped out of the sand, but behind that name remains an entire administration, mostly anonymous, whose coordinated labour allowed Hatshepsut's road to reach from the Nile toward the mountain. The story of Hatshepsut's erasure has long been told as a drama of revenge. In the familiar version, Thutmose III waits through years of humiliation, seizes full control after her death, and orders her memory destroyed in anger. Faces are hacked away, cartouches chiselled out, statues smashed, and the female king condemned to oblivion. It is compelling because it turns damaged stone into evidence of private emotion. It is also too simple. The surviving monuments point instead to a long, uneven sequence of repair, selective attack, ritual deactivation, reuse, and later destruction carried out under different rulers for different reasons. The timing alone complicates the revenge story. Hatshepsut died after roughly 2 decades of shared rule, and Thutmose III then governed alone for many more years. The most systematic alterations to her images appear not immediately after her death, but later in his reign. That delay matters. A ruler consumed by hatred might be expected to act quickly. Instead, temples continued to function, and evidence from the newly excavated complex has been interpreted by the field team as showing repairs undertaken under Thutmose III. Repair does not prove affection, and it does not mean the later campaign never happened. The attacks were also selective. Hatshepsut's images were not erased everywhere, and not every form of her name was treated identically. In some places, her figure was removed while surrounding scenes remained. In others, royal titles were altered or replaced. Images presenting her as king seem to have been targeted more consistently than references to her earlier roles as queen or royal daughter. The result looks less like an attempt to eliminate every memory of one person, and more like an effort to reshape the official succession of kings. One likely motive was dynastic. Near the end of his reign, Thutmose III had reason to secure the position of his son and successor, Amenhotep II. Hatshepsut's unusual kingship complicated the ideal genealogy through which legitimacy was presented. Removing her from selected sequences could create a cleaner line from Thutmose I to Thutmose II, then to Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. This interpretation does not exclude personal tension, but it places the campaign within institutional concerns about succession, precedent, and royal memory. Scholars still debate the motives, and no surviving decree explains them directly. The physical treatment of Hatshepsut's statues has also been reassessed. For decades, broken sculpture found at Deir el-Bahari seemed to offer the clearest evidence of violent fury. Heads were separated from bodies, faces were damaged, fragments were thrown into pits and quarry fills. Yet a major study published in 2025 by Junyi Wang examined the statues and argued that many had been subjected to ritual deactivation before being reused as building material. In Egyptian practice, a statue was not merely stone-shaped into a likeness. Through ritual, it could become an active vessel of presence. Before such an image was repurposed, it might need to be neutralized. This changes the meaning of breakage. A statue deprived of its nose, face, name, or structural integrity could be rendered incapable of acting ritually. The damage was deliberate, but deliberate damage does not automatically equal uncontrolled rage. Some sculptures appear to have been broken in ways that made their blocks practical for reuse. Fragments entered foundations, ramps, and fills, where they became part of later construction. Ritual deactivation and economic recycling could occur together. The destroyers may have treated the image as dangerous or politically unacceptable while still valuing the stone. That interpretation does not turn the campaign into a respectful retirement. Hatshepsut's royal identity was attacked, images were altered, names removed, statues dismantled, and her place in official king lists largely suppressed. But the process was governed by rules, priorities, and practical decisions. Some statues were treated more harshly than others. Some fragments were carefully deposited, others were reused. The evidence suggests planning rather than a single explosion of anger. No single explanation fully accounts for every damaged object because the objects pass through different histories. Later rulers added new layers of destruction. During the Amun period, agents of Akhenaten attacked images and names of gods, especially Amun, throughout Egypt. Hatshepsut's temple was deeply connected to Amun, so divine figures and inscriptions were vulnerable even when the king's image was not the target. After traditional cults were restored, some damaged scenes were repaired. Ramesside activity introduced further alteration, dismantling, and reuse. Earthquakes, rockfall, water, quarrying, later burials, and settlement activity continued to transform the complex. What modern excavators uncover is therefore a surface on which multiple campaigns overlap. This layered history makes individual scars difficult to date. A missing face might belong to the proscription under Thutmose III, the Amarna attack on a deity, later quarrying, or natural breakage after collapse. A recut inscription can preserve traces of more than one intervention. Blocks found far from their original walls may have been moved several times before burial. Archaeologists compare carving style, tool marks, replacement names, stratigraphy, and architectural context. But certainty is not always possible. Damage has a history, and it is rarely written beside it. The Valley Temple fragments may eventually sharpen this sequence. Scenes showing Hatshepsut beside Thutmose III can reveal which royal forms were preserved, altered, or discarded. Foundation tablets may show that her names remained untouched below ground, even when visible cartouches were attacked. Repairs attributed to Thutmose III could establish continued use before later proscription, yet the full catalogue has not been published. So the new evidence should not be forced into a conclusion it cannot yet bear. What emerges is more unsettling than the old revenge tale because it shows memory being managed rather than simply destroyed. Hatshepsut's presence was not erased in one night. It was edited across generations. Her monuments were maintained, altered, neutralized, repaired, quarried, and buried. Some images were made powerless, some names were replaced, and some stones were given new architectural lives. The campaign against her memory was real, but it was neither total nor uniform. Ironically, the systems designed to remove her also helped preserve her. Statues reused in foundations survived underground. Cartouches hidden beneath walls escaped attack. Fragments buried as rubble retained colours that open monuments lost. The ruler who was meant to disappear remained everywhere in pieces. Her absence was never complete, because Egyptian stone carried more than one intention at once. A broken statue could be a rejected king, a deactivated sacred object, and a useful building block. A damaged wall could preserve both suppression and the outline of what had been removed. The latest research does not absolve Thutmose III or deny the campaign. It replaces a single emotional story with a more complex archaeology of power, ritual, and reuse. Hatshepsut was not simply erased. Her memory was dismantled, reorganized, and hidden inside the monuments of those who came after her. The Valley Temple did not disappear into empty ground. Long after Hatshepsut's processions ended, the eastern approach to her monument remained useful, sacred, and vulnerable to reuse. Tombs were cut through older levels. Mud brick structures rose over buried walls. Burial shafts entered spaces once designed for royal ceremony. Coins, cartonnage, masks, amulets, pottery, and human remains accumulated above and beside the 18th dynasty foundations. To excavate the lost gateway is therefore to move through a cemetery made from several different periods, each one treating the same landscape according to new beliefs and practical needs. The temple was not merely destroyed and abandoned, it became the ground upon which later generations built their own relationships with death. Some of the earliest funerary evidence in the wider area predates Hatshepsut. Rock-cut tombs associated with the Middle Kingdom show that Western Thebes had already become a landscape of elite burial centuries before her reign. Mentuhotepsuku's great complex at Deir el-Bahari helped establish the bay as a place of royal memory, while cliffs, wadis, and desert margins offered suitable ground for tombs. By the time Hatshepsut built her processional route, she was entering a terrain already marked by the dead. Her architects did not create the sacred West from nothing. They reorganized an older necropolis, drawing its accumulated authority into a new royal axis. Other shafts belonged to the closing years of the 17th dynasty, when Theban rulers were emerging from a period of political division and conflict before the rise of the new kingdom. These burials place the Valley Temple zone close to the transition that made Hatshepsut's dynasty possible. The people interred there inhabited a world in which Thebes was becoming the center of a reunified state. Their tombs survived beneath or near later construction, creating a vertical sequence of memory earlier Theban elites below, Hatshepsut's royal project across the surface, and still later cemeteries above. Among the discoveries announced in 2025 was a tomb associated with Djeser-Djeseru, an official responsible for the palace of Queen Teticheri. Some reports transformed this into the discovery of Teticheri's own tomb, a far more sensational claim but not the best supported reading. The distinction is important. Teticheri was a revered royal woman linked to the family that preceded the 18th dynasty, and to the political recovery of Thebes. A tomb belonging to one of her palace officials reveals something about the administration and social world surrounding her memory. It does not establish that the queen herself was buried there. Djeser-Djeseru is valuable precisely because officials often preserve connections that royal narratives overlook. His title places him within a household organized around Teticheri's estate or palace. Such institutions could continue to matter after the death of the person they served, maintaining cult, property, personnel, and remembrance. His burial near the later Hatshepsut complex suggests how closely royal administration and funerary geography were intertwined. Yet the exact date, original arrangement, and later history of the tomb require careful study. As with the Valley Temple blocks, public announcements provide an outline before full specialist publication supplies the finer structure. Centuries after Hatshepsut, the same area attracted Ptolemaic burials, Mud brick tombs and cemetery installations were constructed on or near the remains of the lower temple. By then, the original gateway had lost much of its architectural identity. Walls may have survived only as low courses, convenient boundaries, or sources of building stone. Later communities could occupy the site without understanding every earlier feature beneath them. A foundation laid for Matkai might become the edge of a tomb. A decorated block once carrying royal ritual could be turned inward as anonymous masonry. Sacred material did not cease to matter, but its meaning changed. The Ptolemaic cemetery also reminds us that Egyptian funerary traditions continued under Greek-speaking rulers. Local religious practices, temple institutions, mummification, amulets, masks, and decorated cartonnage remained active while artistic styles and political structures evolved. Objects recovered from these later levels belonged to a society neither simply ancient Egyptian nor simply Greek. They emerge from centuries of cultural negotiation. A painted mask from this cemetery may be more than 1,000 years younger than Hatshepsut's reliefs, yet both occupied the same few meters of ground. This layered use creates serious archaeological problems. A burial shaft can cut through a wall and remove the evidence needed to reconstruct it. Mud brick can trap displaced temple fragments in secondary positions. Grave construction may reuse carved stone from elsewhere. Robbery, collapse, and later reopening can mix objects from separate periods. An artifact found near a foundation does not automatically belong to the temple. Its depth, soil context, associated pottery, orientation, and relationship to cuts in the ground must all be examined. The site becomes a three-dimensional puzzle in which later activity repeatedly rearranged earlier remains. At the same time, those disturbances sometimes preserved what they damaged. A reused relief block placed face inward inside a later wall could retain pigment protected from weather. Rubble packed around a tomb might seal fragments that had already fallen from the valley temple. Mud brick could cover foundation lines and protect them from later quarrying. Destruction and preservation are not opposites here. The same act can erase architectural context while shielding a painted surface for centuries. The necropolis also explains why the lost gateway could remain hidden so close to one of Egypt's most famous monuments. Archaeologists had long known that the lower processional zone contained remains, but later cemeteries made broad clearance ethically, technically, and methodologically complex. Every phase deserves documentation. A Ptolemaic tomb cannot simply be treated as unwanted material blocking access to an 18th dynasty temple. The later cemetery is part of the history of the place, and removing it without careful recording would repeat the loss archaeology is meant to prevent. No single map can show this landscape as one fixed moment. In one century it contains Middle Kingdom tombs. In another, Hatshepsut's gateway and causeway dominate the plain. Later, royal memory is altered, walls are dismantled, and stones are reused. Still later, mud brick tombs rise over the ruins. Each generation encounters fragments of what came before and decides, consciously or not, what can be reused, ignored, protected, or buried. The Valley Temple returned because this accumulation was patiently separated rather than swept aside. Beneath coins and masks, beneath mud, brick and shafts, the foundations still held their line. Royal names remained under walls. Painted blocks survived inside disturbed deposits. The cemetery did not merely conceal Hatshepsut's gateway, it became part of the mechanism by which the gateway endured. What appears from above as one patch of desert is, below the surface, a compressed history of Thebes, where the dead of different ages were placed beside within, and over the ruins of a ruler whose own memory had never entirely left the ground. The rediscovery of the Valley Temple belongs to a much longer history of excavation, reconstruction, and argument at Deir el-Bahari. Long before the 2025 announcement, archaeologists had been tracing Hatshepsut's monument through collapsed terraces, buried statues, reused blocks, damaged reliefs, and records scattered across institutions. The lost gateway did not suddenly enter scholarship from complete obscurity. It emerged as the newest problem in a landscape study for more than a century, where every generation inherited both discoveries and mistakes from those before it. In the late 19th century, Edouard Naville led major excavations at Hatshepsut's terraced temple for the Egypt Exploration Fund. His teams cleared debris, exposed architectural spaces, copied inscriptions, and recovered relief fragments that helped define the monument for modern scholarship. The methods of that era were ambitious but uneven by present standards. Clearing could be rapid, documentation selective, and later phases sometimes treated as obstacles to the pharaonic building beneath them. Even so, Naville's publications preserved information that would otherwise have vanished and established the framework through which the upper temple could be studied. Howard Carter also worked at Deir el-Bahari before his name became inseparable from Tutankhamun. As a young archaeologist and artist, he participated in recording an excavation in the Theban necropolis. His early career formed within this demanding landscape of cliffs, tombs, and fragmented monuments. Egyptian archaeology was built through long apprenticeships rather than single famous discoveries. The skills later associated with one sealed tomb were sharpened among ruins where almost nothing remained sealed. During the early 20th century, the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Egyptian expedition transformed knowledge of the site. Under Herbert Winlock, excavators investigated areas around Hatshepsut's temple and encountered immense quantities of broken sculpture. Fragments lay in quarry fills and dumps, many deliberately damaged or reused in antiquity. At first glance, the pieces seemed hopeless: a face without a crown, a torso without a head, sections of thrones, knees, hands, and royal regalia distributed across separate deposits. Winlock's teams recorded, compared, and joined them, eventually reconstructing more than 30 statues in varying states of completeness. That achievement changed the image of Hatshepsut. The statues revealed how many forms she'd assumed within the complex seated king, kneeling offerer, standing sovereign, sphinx, and Osirid figure. Some displayed the conventional masculine body of kingship, while inscriptions preserved her identity. Others helped scholars trace stylistic development and workshop practice. The restored sculptures now seen in museums often appear inevitable, as if they had survived nearly whole. In reality, many are modern reunions of ancient fragments recovered from destruction deposits. Their surfaces conceal years of searching for joins. Winlock's work also shaped the revenge narrative that dominated interpretations of Hatshepsut's damaged monuments. Pits filled with broken statues seemed to record violent annihilation. That conclusion was understandable, but modern reassessment shows how interpretation changes when ritual practice, reuse, and construction history are considered together. The same fragments can support different historical models depending on their break patterns, placement, and relationship to later architecture. Archaeology advances not only by finding new objects, but by asking old objects better questions. After the era of large foreign expeditions, Egyptian authorities and international teams increasingly focused on conservation, architectural reconstruction, and detailed study. From the 1960s onward, the Polish-Egyptian mission at Deir el-Bahari undertook sustained work on Djeser-Djeseru. Architects, archaeologists, epigraphers, conservators, geologists, chemists, and photographers collaborated to stabilize walls, restore colonnades, and document reliefs. The temple visible today is therefore neither an untouched ancient ruin nor a modern replica. It is the result of decades of anastylosis, conservation choices, and structural intervention. Anastylosis uses original architectural elements wherever possible, supplementing them only as needed to restore stability and legibility. The principle sounds straightforward, but fragmented monuments rarely offer simple answers. A block may fit physically in more than one place. A column drum may be ancient while its exact sequence is uncertain. Reconstructing too little can leave a building unstable. Reconstructing too much can create false certainty. Every restored wall embodies a judgment about evidence. The Polish-Egyptian work also deepened understanding of the temple's painted decoration. Conservators identified fragile layers, earlier restorations, varnishes, repainting, and damage from salts, water, soot, and human intervention. Their research showed that colour was not a final ornamental coating, but part of a complex surface history. Some scenes underwent ancient correction or later restoration. Scientific imaging and material analysis can distinguish phases that the eye alone merges together. This century-long record places the 2022-2025 excavation in perspective. The New Valley Temple material is significant not because no one had ever searched the processional landscape, but because modern fieldwork recovered a concentration of foundations, deposits, name tablets, and decorated blocks capable of reopening the lower complex as a major research problem. The discovery extends the archaeological story eastward from the terraces toward the ancient river margin. It reconnects a famous monument with an approach that survived far less visibly. It also inherits an enormous documentary burden. Newly excavated blocks must be compared with fragments stored from earlier campaigns, museum collections, excavation photographs, notebooks, architectural plans, and unpublished archives. A piece recovered in 2023 may join one found decades earlier. An inscription copied before a block was moved may preserve context now lost. Old records can contain errors, but ignoring them would discard part of the evidence. The Valley Temple may eventually be reconstructed through dialogue between new trenches and century-old documentation. Scholars still debate how much restoration should be physical and how much should remain virtual. Digital models can test joins, reconstruct sightlines, and display alternative arrangements without forcing stone into one final position. Three-dimensional scanning preserves surface detail and allows fragments to be compared, yet digital certainty can be deceptive. A plausible model remains a hypothesis unless supported by context, dimensions, carving continuity, and material evidence. The 2025 announcement is therefore not the beginning of Hatshepsut's archaeological return. It is another turn in a patient, unfinished process. Neville cleared the terraces, Carter learned among the ruins, Winlock reassembled shattered royal bodies, Egyptian and Polish specialists stabilized architecture and recovered painted surfaces. The current mission has brought the lower gateway back into focus through foundations and thousands of fragments. Each generation has made the monument more legible while discovering how much remains uncertain. Hatshepsut's complex survives today because archaeology itself has become cumulative. A broken face recorded in 1911 can inform a theory published in 2025. A wall restored decades ago can be re-examined with new imaging. A tablet emerging near the causeway can change how an official's role is understood. The work does not move in a straight line toward perfect reconstruction. It advances through correction, revision, and the willingness to leave some stones unplaced. The Valley Temple has returned not to an empty field of knowledge, but to a century-old conversation still being rebuilt fragment by fragment. After more than 1,000 decorated fragments have been lifted, named, photographed, and protected, the lost gateway remains suspended between discovery and reconstruction. Archaeologists can now say with confidence that important sections of Hatshepsut's Valley Temple foundations survive at the eastern end of the ceremonial axis. They can identify foundation deposits, royal name tablets, and blocks carrying ritual imagery associated with Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. They can show that the lower monument once formed the threshold between the river landscape and the causeway leading toward Djeser-Djeseru. Yet confidence ends where the surviving relationships break. The temple has returned as a body of evidence, not as a complete building, and much of its original form still lies beyond what the published record can establish. The most obvious unanswered question concerns the plan. Foundation walls define parts of the structure, but later tombs, quarrying, erosion, and the removal of masonry have interrupted their lines. Some rooms or courts may be recoverable through excavation. Others may have vanished so completely that only displaced decoration hints at their existence. The precise location of entrances, columns, barque stations, storage spaces, and ritual chambers cannot yet be treated as settled. Even the relationship between individual wall sections and the beginning of the causeway requires the full architectural record. A convincing reconstruction must explain not only where stone stood, but how people, offerings, and the divine barque moved through it. The decorated blocks pose an even larger puzzle. Reports describe more than 1,000 pieces, with an approximate figure of 1,500 given by Zahi Hawass, but a number alone does not reveal how many walls can be restored. One large scene may survive in dozens of fragments, while hundreds of isolated pieces may never find a secure position. Broken edges, carving depth, stone thickness, paint bands, scale, and inscriptions can establish joins, yet many fragments share similar features. A royal arm raised in offering might belong to several rituals. A blue border may have repeated throughout the building. Without original fine positions or continuous joins, an attractive arrangement can remain only a possibility. A complete scholarly catalogue would allow specialists to test these possibilities openly. It would record measurements, stone types, inscriptions, pigment remains, damage, conservation treatments, and proposed relationships among fragments. Architectural drawings could show which pieces came from sealed deposits, later walls, cemetery fills, or disturbed soil. Such publication is slow because each entry must be checked, and because conservation may reveal details not visible at excavation. By August 26, no dedicated peer-reviewed study available publicly had presented the complete assemblage, a final joining scheme, and a comprehensive pigment analysis. This does not make the announcement unreliable. It means the discovery is still moving from field report toward fully testable reconstruction. Color remains one of the greatest promises and one of the clearest limits. The surviving red, yellow, blue, green, black, and white areas offer information about ancient surface preparation, painting sequence, iconography, and workshop practice. Scientific analysis may eventually identify mineral mixtures, binders, varnishes, restoration phases, and changes caused by burial. For now, research on polychromy in the upper mortuary temple provides valuable comparison, but it cannot substitute for direct study of every newly excavated lower temple fragment. The colors are real and exceptionally preserved. Their complete chemical history has not yet been published. There is also the question of what remains underground. Later cemeteries and mud brick structures cover or cut through parts of the ancient processional landscape. Excavation must proceed without treating those later remains as disposable obstacles. Some portions of the valley temple may survive beneath them, while other areas may contain only foundation trenches or robbed-out walls. Further work could reveal architectural connections, additional deposits, or blocks whose edges complete scenes already known. It could also show that hoped-for sections were removed in antiquity. Archaeology offers no guarantee that the missing parts are waiting neatly below the next layer. The future of the recovered material is equally unresolved. Some blocks may be suitable for physical reassembly if their joins and original positions are secure. Others may be displayed individually, stored in controlled conditions, or studied through digital models. Reconstructing walls at the site could restore spatial meaning, but placing uncertain fragments permanently risks turning hypothesis into architecture. Moving pieces to museums or conservation stores protects them more easily, yet removes them from the landscape that gives them meaning. The best solution may differ from block to block, guided by stability, context, and the strength of each proposed reconstruction. What the excavation has already changed is the balance between absence and evidence. The Valley Temple can no longer be imagined only as a missing box at the end of an architectural plan. Its foundations have dimensions. Its buried deposits preserve the acts that began construction. Its name tablets repeat Hatshepsut's identity beneath the ruined walls. Its reliefs show a ceremonial world in which she and Thutmose III served the gods within the same royal order. Its colours demonstrate how different the gateway once looked from the pale remains through which modern visitors understand Egypt. The discovery also resists the easiest version of Hatshepsut's story. It does not reveal a complete temple erased by one enemy and recovered in one triumphant season. Instead, it exposes a monument shaped by foundation rituals, continued use, repair, selective prescription, ritual deactivation, reuse, cemetery construction, flood deposits, excavation, and conservation. Every stage removed something and preserved something else. Thutmose III's reign cannot be reduced to revenge. Senenmut cannot be declared the solitary architect from one tablet. The Punt expedition cannot be assigned to the new blocks without evidence. The building cannot be called restored simply because its fragments are visible again. What returns from the sand is therefore not certainty, but resolution at a finer scale. A gateway existed here. It belonged to Hatshepsut's lower ceremonial complex. It connected the ancient river approach with a causeway running west toward the terraced temple beneath the cliffs. Its walls carried painted ritual scenes and royal names. Its foundations received deposits meant to bind the ruler to the structure. Beyond those points, the questions remain active, and that is not a failure of archaeology. It is the honest shape of knowledge when a monument survives in pieces. Perhaps this is the quiet power of the newly exposed colour. It does not restore the past as a finished picture. It interrupts the blankness. A blue line proves that a surface once continued. A red hand implies a body, an offering, and a ceremony whose other participants may still be scattered through storage trays or buried ground. A cartouche beneath a wall preserves a name that later rulers tried to remove from sight. Each fragment reduces the darkness without abolishing it. Across the plain, the terraces of Djeser-Djeseru still catch the changing light beneath the western cliffs. Farther east, the lower gateway survives mostly below the level of memory, where fields, graves, sediment, and modern roads have altered the ancient approach. Between them lies the causeway, sometimes visible, sometimes reconstructed, carrying the imagination across a distance once filled with priests, bearers, officials, incense, music, and the hidden image of Amun. The procession is gone, but the axis remains. Its silence still preserves the shape of movement across the vanished landscape. Time rarely preserves human intentions in the form their makers requested. Kings build for eternity, yet roofs fall. Names are carved to endure, yet chisels return to remove them. Images are made active through ritual, then broken so they can no longer act. Stone is reused by people who need a wall more than they need an ancestor's memory. Centuries later, the discarded block becomes precious because a trace of paint survives on its inward face. Hatshepsut's monument carries all of those reversals. She used architecture to make an extraordinary kingship appear permanent and natural. Later history fragmented that claim, but fragmentation did not end it. Her statues survived in fills. Her names waited under foundations. Her colours rested beneath dust. Even attempts to reorganize her memory became part of the evidence through which she is known. The valley will not yield every answer. Some walls are gone. Some scenes will never be joined. And some colours will fade despite every effort to protect them. The complete gateway may remain forever beyond reconstruction. Yet incompleteness is not silence. It is the form in which most of the ancient world reaches the present, a line without its figure, a road without its procession, a name beneath a vanished wall. As evening settles over western Thebes, the cliffs lose their glare and the terraces soften into shadow. The Nile continues beyond the fields, no longer following precisely the channel known to Hatshepsut. Under the ground between river and mountain, more stone may still carry colour. It waits without knowing whether it will be found. Above it, wind moves lightly across the sand, covering footprints, rounding edges, and keeping the last fragments of the gateway in darkness. For now, the lost temple has not risen. It has opened its eyes only slightly, through blue, red, yellow, and black, and through that narrow opening an ancient road becomes visible once more.